Welcome to the InfoWars Nightly News. I'm David Knight. It's Monday, December 16th, 2013, and here are our top stories.
Tonight, constitutional sheriffs refuse gun control. Then, alleged Boston bomber Tamerlan believed he was a victim of mind control. And don't be fooled by mainstream NSA reports. That's next on the InfoWars Nightly News.
I get mad because my life has been stolen from me. You think it's fun to deal with a criminal government? You think I don't know?
Well, the Boston Globe has released a 5-month investigation, a 73-page report on the Tsarnaev family. Now, they bill it as an in-depth investigation, but really it's kind of more like a People magazine profile. Nothing about Uncle Ruslan's CIA connections. As a matter of fact, there was no mention of the CIA at all. And of course, Ruslan was the only sane member of the family, according to the reporter. Anything that questioned the official narrative was just dismissed without any explanation. The Boston bomber is believed, however, to be the victim of mind control. That's the only nugget that came out of this, and Paul Joseph Watson did an interesting story on this today. He said he believed in majestic mind control, which is a way of breaking down a person and creating an alternative personality with which they must coexist. Now, here's the key. You can give them a signal, a phrase, or a gesture, and bring out the alternate personality and make them do things. Tamerlan thought someone might have done that to him. Well, of course, this is something that we've seen all along. Now, it could be that he was just schizophrenic and hearing voices, but when he talks about people getting him to do things based on cue, that sounds an awful lot like what we learned from the church committee hearings back in the 1970s about the MK Ultra program. We also saw this discussed in detail by many shooters, Sirhan, one of those. Now, with all these other events surrounding the Boston bombing, which this reporter does not even cover, it's actually more incriminating than what Aaron Alexis wrote on his gun when he did the Navy Yard shooting, my ELF gun, remember that? Indicating, as he had told many other people, that he thought he was a victim of mind control. But all of these circumstances are not even addressed in this 73-page article. But look at how the media covers up the shooting that was just last Friday. In a story this weekend from Mikhail Phelan, he says, the media works to keep mass shooters' profiles secret. He said the media can almost immediately be seen attempting to link deranged shooters with the political right. But as facts come in, the desire to connect shooters to their political ideologies quickly erodes as the same antidepressant-taking, left-wing occultist profile emerges. And he goes through many of these here. He talks about how in Arizona, the shooter, Jared Laufner, was actually engaged in occult rituals, how the Aurora Theater shooter, James Holmes, was linked to fringe elements of the Occupy movement, even though ABC News reported he was a Tea Party member. Then we see that Sandy Hook gunman Adam Lanza was also obsessed with playing video games and updating his online devil-worshipping page. And then finally, there's a shooter from last Friday. Now, he was described in the local paper as being an opinionated socialist, and then they went back and they took that word out. Now, the reason was they said that that was a comment that was made by his fellow students, although the whole point of the article was to examine the viewpoints of his fellow students. How did they see him? What did they see him doing? But of course, they also described him as being a committed Keynesian. So he could understand the meaning of Keynesianism, but he couldn't understand the meaning of socialism, according to the press. That's the way they spin the news. That's the way they twist it. Now, this article from Breitbart points out how it's not just the shooter personal profiles that they're manipulating, but actually the description of the event to suit their purposes. The armed school officer was actually a hero in the Colorado shooting. It says, have you heard about the heroic deputy sheriff who saved countless lives during the Arapahoe High School shooting? Probably not. And that's odd because there simply isn't much doubt about the value of his timely actions. Now, what happened is that the entire incident only lasted 80 seconds. But you don't learn until paragraph 18 why it only lasted 80 seconds. The rampage might have resulted in many more casualties had it not been for the quick response of a deputy sheriff who was working as a school resources officer at the school. Now, that's what they tell you in the CNN report, but they don't say that until paragraph 18. What they also tell you is that he was wearing a bandolier of shells across his chest, but he only got off 5 shots. And of course, one of those horribly struck an innocent student, Claire Davis. Her family has asked for prayer, so that name is Claire Davis. She's in critical condition. But again, the story is that a good man with a gun stopped a bad man with a gun. We see that over and over again. But look at this other Mockingbird report that came out over the weekend from 60 Minutes. a whitewash, a total whitewash of the NSA. And of course, this is a guy who has worked in the past for many years as a PR guy for the law enforcement officers, for the intelligence community. He is going back to working for the New York Police Department very soon. But in this report, according to The Wire, 60 Minutes says NSA is good and Snowden is bad. It was just that simplistic. It says, yeah, that's right. The NSA is, quote, defending our civil liberties and privacy, according to Director General Keith Alexander. And on hearing this, the reporter, John Miller, just nods. That's right, just accepts it, never questions it. But everybody is talking about what a puff piece this was, how he didn't get any tough questions, wasn't challenged on this. No skeptics of the NSA, no critics of the NSA were interviewed. But Paul Joseph Watson picked up on something very interesting.
A few times where General Alexander would do a timeout.
Did the NSA actually find a foreign power that had identified this capability and discussed using it offensively?
I need timeout on that.
He looked over like this to the whole crowd of people over there in the dark and said, "Can I answer that?"
Did you get that? A crowd of people in the dark? Some kind of shadow government? Who are these guys? Because this is the NSA's director, and he has to ask these guys permission for what he can and cannot say. As Watson points out, one of the more jaw-dropping moments to emerge out of the 60 Minutes profile piece was when NSA Director Keith Alexander had to ask permission from his superiors on whether or not he could answer a question. And of course, these are people that the reporter, nobody knows who they are. They're not given a name, and they're in the shadows. And so that kind of raises a question. Is Washington become so secretive, so hidden, that people can get away with anything if they appeal to national security? Well, it appears that they can. Look at this guy from the EPA. We got a climate change expert's fraud was a crime of massive proportions, says the feds. The EPA's highest paid employee and a leading expert on climate change deserves to go to prison for at least 30 months for lying to his bosses, saying that he was a CIA spy working in Pakistan so he could avoid doing his real job, said federal prosecutors. Now, this guy was earning a salary of over $206,000 a year. He was the highest paid official at the EPA. He even made more than Gina McCarthy, the agency's administrator. And he didn't show up at the EPA for months at a time sometimes. At one interval, he didn't show up for 18 months. And of course, he said, well, I was in Pakistan and I was doing work involving torture. Somebody that I was going to replace was being tortured over there. But this is what the government does to us all the time. All it has to do is invoke national security, and they can bluff their way through anything, and they can get paid anything. They can charge us massive amounts of money. This is a metaphor for what the entire government is doing, charging us massive amounts of money and bluffing us by saying that it's too secretive, we can't even look. But of course, he was a climate change expert, so he was probably heavily into fraud in the first place. Now, this next article is NSA officials are considering whether or not they will allow Snowden to kind of barter his documents for a pardon. Some want him to be able to do that, and others are pushing back on that. The National Security Agency officials are offering a controversial amnesty that would return Ed Snowden to the United States in exchange for the extensive document trove that he took from the agency. But the problem with all this is that according to Snowden and Glenn Greenwald, Snowden has already turned over all the documents and no longer has possession of any of them. They're in the sole possession of Glenn Greenwald. And he is doling these out as he sees fit. And according to him, he's only put out about 1% of these documents. And of course, the editor of The Guardian was called before Parliament last week and said that he shouldn't be criticized for the secrets that have been leaked about criminal activity on the part of the NSA and the CIA and others, because he said they've consulted with American and British intelligence over 100 times about what can and can't be released. And so that raises a real important question. Are the documents being managed in a way to do what some would call a limited hangout, kind of a information term of a false flag? There's a big question about that, and Sibel Edmonds wrote an article about that and got into a war on Twitter with Glenn Greenwald at the end of last week. I did a report on that. You can see that report on the Alex Jones channel on YouTube. I will have Sibel Edmonds on tomorrow, and we're going to talk about this in depth. What is going on with the documents? Are they being put out slowly to cover up for financial institutions in particular, particularly PayPal, The man who owns PayPal is the one who's giving $250 million to Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill to start a new quote-unquote alternative media organization. So the question is, what are we being told, and what are the motivations of the people who are releasing this information? Now, if you want to see the kind of danger that the government is really represents to all of us, take a look at how this is morphing and controlling and protecting the government. So they always invoke national security, but the national security is really about continuity of government. It's not about protecting you at all. This is an exclusive story from Mikhail Thalen and StoryLeak. It is in Washington state where representatives are being asked to pass legislation concerning the government's ability to implement continuity of government. Now, continuity of government was created at the height of the Cold War, as he says, during the 1960s, designed to give the federal government martial law powers in the event of a nuclear attack. But now they're looking for any excuse to invoke martial law. Look at what they're asking in Washington state. They're saying, change only enemy attack to any emergency disaster attack. They also want to give them a longer period of time. Initially, according to the now existing Washington state law, they would only have 30 days after a disaster, but now they want to amend that so that it would be as soon as practical. So this is what FEMA has been about all along. This is what we've been telling you all along. It's about continuity of government. It's not about aiding people in a disaster. They do a terrible job of that, just like the schools do a terrible job of teaching your children how to read and write. They have a different agenda. You need to understand what that is, and you can clearly see that in these changes that they're making in the Washington state legislation. Now, in our final story before the break, we got scores have been killed in Iraq bloodshed ahead of a Shiite holy day. Suicide bombers and gunmen killed scores of people in Iraq on Monday in attacks mostly targeting Shiite Muslim pilgrims and official buildings ahead of a major ritual next week. Now, these are al-Qaeda-linked Sunni Muslim militants, and it's the deadliest levels of violence in 5 years. I guess it's a little bit too soon to declare victory from a troop surge in Iraq. Unfortunately, it looks like al-Qaeda is surging again and will likely be in charge. Even though we took out Saddam Hussein, it looks like we're now going to have the CIA's al-Qaeda ultimately in charge in Iraq. That's the way things appear to be trending now. We'll be right back after the break. We've got information about Google's rise of the robots and gun rights fights. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now, there's been a lot of news this year about new gun laws in California, but it's not a new law, but an old law that's about to go into effect that's creating a lot of stir now. This is a law that was passed back in 2011, but is going to go into effect at the end of this year. And what it's going to do is require registration of shotguns and rifles, give them the same record-keeping requirements that currently apply to handguns. This is a prelude to gun confiscation, as it always has been, and we've seen this happening in New York State. Once you register these items with the government, it's very easy for them to come around and either confiscate them under a pretense or just have an all-out plan of confiscation. That's why we're very concerned about registration. The Second Amendment protects us against infringement. Infringement means that they're going to gradually move it around the edges, and that's what we see. Boiling frogs in water, a gradual infringement of rights until they take them away altogether by confiscation. But there are sheriffs who are refusing to implement some of these gun laws. We see an article today from the New York Times. Sheriffs refuse to enforce laws on gun control. And what they're focusing on is Colorado, where we saw just a couple of months ago 2 legislators recalled because of new gun laws. Now we see sheriffs there standing up and rebelling against this. The incident that they refer to here, and you can see that picture up on the article, says when Sheriff John Cook of Weld County explains in speeches why he's not enforcing the state's new gun laws, he holds up 2 30-round magazines. He said before July 1st, one of them was purchased, and he said maybe the other one was purchased afterwards. He switches them around and says, can you tell the difference? As a sheriff's deputy or as a sheriff, he says he can't. And so he's not going to be enforcing that law. It's an impractical law to enforce, but it is also an infringement of the Second Amendment rights and also of constitutional oath that he took. And that's the exact point. There was also a link today from the Drudge Report to the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, and they report that they have had a total number of 18 sheriff's associations, but 479 individual sheriffs say that they're going to stand with their oath to defend the Second Amendment. And when the local gun laws or the federal gun laws violate the Second Amendment, they are not going to enforce those laws. Now you can watch the InfoWars Nightly News streaming live as it happens for free.
Check it out at infowars.com/show.
And bring out the alternate personality and make them do things. Tamerlan thought someone might have done that to him. Well, of course, this is something that we've seen all along. Now, it could be that he was just schizophrenic and hearing voices, but when he talks about people getting him to do things based on cue, that sounds an awful lot like what we learned from the church committee hearings back in the 1970s about the MK Ultra program. We also saw this discussed in detail by many shooters, Sirhan, one of those. Now, with all these other events surrounding the Boston bombing, which this reporter does not even cover, it's actually more incriminating than what Aaron Alexis wrote on his gun when he did the Navy Yard shooting, my ELF gun, remember that? Indicating, as he had told many other people, that he thought he was a victim of mind control. But all of these circumstances are not even addressed in this 73-page article. But look at how the media covers up the shooting that was just last Friday. In a story this weekend from Mikhail Phelan, he says the media works to keep mass shooters' profiles secret. He said the media can almost immediately be seen attempting to link deranged shooters with the political right. But as facts come in, the desire to connect shooters to their political ideologies quickly erodes as the same antidepressant-taking, left-wing Welcome to the InfoWars Nightly News. I'm David Knight. It's Monday, December 16th, 2013, and here are our top stories.
Tonight, constitutional sheriffs refuse gun control.
Profile. Nothing about Uncle Ruslan's CIA connections. As a matter of fact, there was no mention of the CIA at all. And of course, Ruslan was the only sane member of the family, according to the reporter. Anything that questioned the official narrative was just dismissed without any explanation. The Boston bomber is believed, however, to be the victim of mind control. That's the only nugget that came out of this, and Paul Joseph Watson did an interesting story on this today. He said he believed in majestic mind control, which is a way of breaking down a person and creating an alternative personality with which they must coexist. Now, here's the key. You can give them a signal, a phrase, or a gesture.
Then, alleged Boston bomber Tamerlan believed he was a victim of mind control. And don't be fooled by mainstream NSA reports. That's next on the InfoWars Nightly News.
I get mad because my life has been stolen from me. You think it's fun to deal with a criminal government? You think I don't know?
Well, the Boston Globe has released a 5-month investigation, a 73-page report on the Tsarnaev family. Now, they bill it as an in-depth investigation, but really it's kind of more like a People magazine.